Good morning, everybody, transit folk. I'm glad you could join us this morning. In normal years, we'd be having this briefing in person, and we'd be looking forward to having our legislative reception this evening over at Main Street Station. But again, this year, due to COVID cases and what we thought might have been potential winter weather, we're fortunate to have the option to meet virtually. So one good thing about meeting virtually is that we have more people participating. So we're pleased to have our VTA president, Justin Wilson, mayor of the city of Alexandria. He'll kick things off for us in just a moment. And anyway, I hope everybody can hear us. We are recording this. We will have it available for members later. And one of the things that we'll encourage you to do is to submit your questions through the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And as the schedule allows, as we go through this morning's briefing, we'll pause and answer as many questions as we can. So anyway, with that, we'll begin with Mayor Wilson. Thank you, Mr. President. Please kick us off.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for your leadership, Lisa, and your adaptability in planning this session this morning. Obviously, it's frustrating to not be together in person, but it's good to be together. You know, this is certainly an important time for transit in the Commonwealth and those that are leading transit systems and the investments around the Commonwealth. Our transit agencies have been enormously resilient as they have bounced from wave to wave this pandemic and adapted to new public health standards, supporting employees and struggling with a lot of staffing challenges, particularly of late. As we hopefully put this pandemic behind us, our transit agencies are left with a daunting task of rebuilding ridership and making transit more relevant to those that are never going to return to an office, and addressing some of the persistent inequities in transportation investments this pandemic has exacerbated and highlighted. But in this challenge is some great opportunity with the new bipartisan infrastructure legislation, providing once in a generation investments in transit around our Commonwealth, and providing the opportunity for new investments in the future. This is how we're going to sustain and grow transit in Virginia. Transit agencies have met every challenge thrown at them in the last 2 years, and they will emerge from this moment a heck of a lot stronger. On the forefront of that effort are some people you're going to hear from this morning, and they're going to be leading us forward as we look forward to benefiting from their insights this morning. Thank you so much for being here and being a part of this session. And without further ado, I want to turn it back to Lisa so we can get on with the program. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So I also want to thank our event sponsors who are supporting VTA for this event, and also for our upcoming 2020 annual conference, which will be in Roanoke on June 1st and 2nd. So those companies are Sunny Merriman, Keolis, National Express Transit, VIA, WSP, Kimley Horn, and Transurban. So we thank you and appreciate all you do to support our work. I also want to recognize VTA Deputy Director Danny Plugger for all he does to support our legislative program and for being our Zoom master this morning. And I know he's on the Zoom. Also is our VTA Legislative Chair, Greg Potts with WMATA. So thanks for all the work you do. Before we launch into the program, I thought I'd take a minute to introduce the speakers in advance so the program can flow. Unfortunately, Secretary of Transportation Shep Miller and House Transportation Chair Terry Austin couldn't be with us this morning, so we're going to try to reschedule them next month. So today we do have with us Jennifer Mitchell, DRPT Director, Senator Jennifer McClellan, the patron of our Transit Zero Emission Transition Fund Bill and ARPA budget amendment for transit worker pay, Jim Regimbal with Fiscal Analytics, Conor Kish of Sierra Club Virginia Chapter, and as we conclude around 11 o'clock or 11:15, President Wilson will close us out. So I want to thank all of these individuals who are taking time out of their very busy schedules, because General Assembly gets a little crazy as we get into this week. So anyway, we'll start with some basics just to set the table. So here's an overview of our session. It convened on January 12th. Crossover Day, that is the last day that the House of Origin can consider its own legislation before crossing over to the other chamber, February 15th. Scheduled to adjourn on March the 12th. This is a long session because it's It's a full budget session, so it's 60 days. Other changes that we're experiencing this year is we have a new GOP majority. We have 52 Republicans and 48 Democrats in our House of Delegates, which also brings with that new leadership. We have a new Speaker of the House and new committee chairs. So there's been some shuffling on the diocese in the Capitol and the General Assembly building. The Senate remains Democratic majority, 21-19, with a Republican Lieutenant Governor, Winsome Sears, who can break ties. So there'll be some interesting votes, no doubt, coming to us this session. Legislators are meeting in person, but they recognize the value of allowing virtual testimony. So you don't have to travel to Richmond this year, and I've already seen how that works with some of the virtual testimony, and it's working pretty well. They had experience with that last session when the legislators were also virtual, at least on the House side, but now they are meeting in person, either at the Capitol or in the General Assembly building, but all subcommittees, committees, and floor sessions are streamed. And virtual testimony and written comments are welcomed in addition to the in-person testimony. I didn't see on the Senate side where you could submit written comments, but if I find that, we'll certainly communicate that. You certainly can on the House side. So Danny, moving along. Next slide. So this is how you communicate with your legislators if you want to find out information about the bills and to sign up to speak. Usually you can do it the day before or the night before the committee meeting at hodspeak.house.virginia.gov. And you can submit written comments there as well. On the state Senate side, it's a different link. They do operate as separate bodies. So here is your Senate link on how to sign up to be a speaker on their bills and their committees. And if you're not sure who your legislators are, because there are 17 new delegates, you can look up who's my legislator and see if you have the correct senators and delegates. Okay. All right, moving on. So at this point, on our agenda, we're going to talk about our overarching priorities. There will be other bills that we support throughout the session for VTA. There will be others that we end up opposing and others that we just watch. So our priorities for starting the session were to protect the existing transit programs and funding that we have had. And Jim's going to talk about this in a little while, but there's a number of bills out there that, and no doubt some budget amendments that will change some of the funding streams. You'll recall in 2020 with the Omnibus bill, all the transit revenues and allocations were lumped in with the rest of transportation so that we are all working together with the same funding stream. So anyway, these advancements, the streamlining of this transportation funding also was beneficial for other programs like the Transit Ridership Incentive Program, Virginia Passenger Rail Authority, and dedication of some regional funds also occurred in 2020. We've got the dedicated funds to NVTA, HR TAC and HRT and GRTC. So we are watching those very carefully with the rollback of the grocery tax that was in Governor Northam's budget and will continue under the General Assembly's direction. Did not make any allowances for replacing the transportation 0.5% of that. So we are going to hopefully find a way to make transportation whole if the grocery tax is rolled back. And there are additional bills to address the gas tax increases over the past 2 years and possibly the regional taxes. So there may be some efforts about that as well, although there was a recent article in the Times Dispatch that the patron, Delegate McNamara, indicated that he's going to remove that regional tax, House Bill 297. So we'll see how that goes. We do see that that the Stewart and Souter line bills addressing the recordation tax that would eliminate the 20 million that HRT is receiving are up in Senate Finance and Appropriations tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So those are on the agenda already. Moving along to the other priorities, protecting what we have. We want to make sure that the DRPT Transit Equity and Modernization Study continues to its conclusion in August of 22, and perhaps setting the stage for additional needs for next session. And we also want to protect the Transforming Rail in Virginia program that to support the state funding initiatives for Long Bridge expansion and the Transforming Rail projects. So that's kind of protecting what we have. In terms of initiatives, things that are new proposals that we have on our list is supporting allocation of the unallocated state ARPA COVID relief funds to public transit workers to assist in the continued recovery of their systems following the pandemic. And as many of you are experiencing, we have severe bus operator and mechanic shortages that are causing transit agencies to curtail and eliminate transit service. So we're hoping that some of those ARPA funds that weren't proposed to be used for any other purposes could be directed to transit workers. So next one is establishing a more balanced transit ridership incentive program, the TRIP program that was originally outlined in the Omnibus bill of 2020. So by establishing a floor of 25% for the free and reduced fare program of TRIP, that would ensure that we would have more funds available for the programs that are quite a bit in demand. The Omnibus Transportation Bill of 2020 allocated 6% of the Commonwealth Transit Fund to the TRIP program, with a 25% cap for the reduced and zero fare for low-income riders. For the initial application period, since COVID, there's been quite a bit of demand for the free and reduced. DRPT received 10 applications for that program, and had to do some shifting around to make sure that all of those qualified applications were funded. Concurrently, the regional fares have not been as much in demand because of COVID and people doing more remote work and not commuting into population centers, cities, and other areas for workforce needs. So there has not been as much demand for an increase in those. Therefore, to balance out that program, we're proposing that a floor of 25% be established for the low income reduced or free fare program. So there are two bills for that. Senator George Barker has Senate Bill 342 on the Senate side, and Delegate Dolores McQuinn on the House side, House Bill 142. The status of those bills is that Barker's bill came up on Thursday in Senate Transportation. It passed unanimously, headed to the floor, and Delegate McQuinn's bill will be heard in House Transportation Subcommittee tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock. So moving on to the Transit Zero Emission Transition Fund. This is sponsored by Senator McClellan, and she will be joining us shortly, maybe to talk a little bit more about this. And this is a starting place to assist transit agencies with implementation of whether they're federal funds or whatever to transition to zero emission fleets. So it's not intended to purchase the actual vehicles. Those funds will come from the formulas from federal and state capital funds, but it will also, because we heard loud and clear from our agencies that they need assistance with planning to conduct the necessary studies to plan effectively for transition, for training funds for the workers to operate and maintain zero emission vehicles, identification of charging infrastructure and possible coordination with federal, local government, school, and private vehicle charging networks. And revenues could also, this fund could also accept funding from private sources, non-governmental sources, and foundation grants. So that is Senate Bill 488. And we'll talk more about that when Senator McClellan gets on with us. And the final one that you've probably all experienced some difficulty with is the current problem with the procurement situation with the state requirement in conflict with the federal code for procurement. So right now, a bill is needed to exempt transit buses from the state procurement requirement to obtain both a manufacturer and a dealer license. And since FTA prohibits that, that would mean that since May, there has not been any ability to procure vehicles. So this would provide relief. Senate Bill 281. So that's a general overview of what our package is to start with. And as other things come up, we will be adding on to this as the need requires. So I see a couple of questions on here before we go to Director Mitchell. So let me see if there's anything. Just a reminder that the recordation bills are coming up to Senate Finance tomorrow. Okay, we covered that. Okay. All right. Well, at this point, Director Mitchell, if you would like to start with your remarks, this is a good time to start. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you to the entire VTA team and the board for all the support that you all have been providing to the transit program and especially in the General Assembly this year. This is actually a relatively light year, if you would, compared to some of the major changes and developments we've had legislatively over the past I'd say the past 3 sessions have all been pretty significant as far as transit and rail have gone. So Lisa, thank you for mentioning the bus procurement issue and Senate Bill 281 that was introduced by Senator Eben. That is one of our highest priorities. We have been working very, very hard with DGS to try to resolve this issue over the past year. I really want to thank our team members, Jen DeBrule, our Chief of Transit, and also Andy Wright, our Manager of Legislation and Policy, who's been very involved with these issues as well. We do recognize it's been a significant impact on many transit agencies that have been trying to procure vehicles. It's also impacted DEQ and our ability to issue procurements for electric vehicles as well. And so we are very optimistic that there can be a resolution through this relatively simple legislative fix to that issue. But that I appreciate VTA's support for that bill and everybody who is speaking with their legislators about that, because it is a very important priority to us statewide. So before I get into our budget and some of our other primary issues right now, I do just want to mention, for those of you that may not have seen this, over the past year, JLARC, who is the General Assembly's arm that does studies, did a study of transportation funding across the state. And they looked at a number of different areas, both within VDOT and DRPT related to our funding programs. I would say overall, the results of our study of the JLARC study were actually very good, particularly as it relates to the transit side. They had very good things to say about the merit program, Smart Scale as well, and some of the objective measures that have been used to distribute funding. And generally, they also, they did spend quite a bit of time digging into asset condition using NTD data for Virginia transit assets compared to other states. And while they identified a few areas that need some improvement, they really generally found that transit agencies' state of good repair is generally in better condition than that of nationwide averages. They also found that while agencies may have sufficient operating funds in the short term, particularly with some of the federal COVID relief funding, but that the longer term challenges for ridership could pose longer term issues for sustainable funding. They also concluded that capital funding may not be enough to meet the capital needs across the state. While the federal infrastructure bill will help, they suggested that the CTB allocate surplus funds to transit capital. And that's actually what the CTB did back in December. They allocated $39 million in surplus priority transportation funds to the transit capital program so that we could fund some additional minor enhancement and major expansion projects, particularly some additional bus shelters and technology projects, and major capital projects such as the Shirlington maintenance facility for Arlington Transit. In addition to that, in January, the CTB adjusted the 6-year plan to take into account surplus FY22 funding. And that was from the information and the new budget or revenue forecast that came out with the governor's budget in mid-December. That provided an additional $185 million to the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund. So that's was then allocated to both capital and operating funds by formula. And so those operating funds will flow through to all of the transit agencies across the state. You can find additional information about that in the CTB's meeting last week. If you look into the agenda items, and the decision brief and resolution that came along with that included a table that shows how operating funds will be increased this year for all of the transit agencies across the state. So really very good news for us at DRPT over the past several months. A little bit about the budget that we are that we've included in the budget request in for this biennium and also the next biennium. We'll be allocating in FY22 $935 million, or I'm sorry, that we've been appropriated. In FY23, that would be $865 million and about $880 million in FY24. And then what that means for our public transportation programs is that in FY23, they would go up to $754 million. And then in FY24, based on the existing budget request, would go up to $769 million. Again, that's what's in the budget request in House Bill 29 and also House Bill 30 as well. That would represent an increase across all of our components of our mass transit fund, including transit operating and capital assistance, funding for WMATA operating and capital. We do have $159 million forecasted or allocated for our WMATA dedicated capital funds through FY24 as well as the dedicated $50 million a year for PREA support for WMATA, which now comes off the top of our Mass Transit Trust Fund after changes from the Omnibus bill. On the rail side as well, we've had a big bump up in funding in FY22 as a result of the surplus and some other allocations as well. But that will level out at about $88 million for FY23 and FY24 for both our passenger and rail freight programs. Two other things I wanted to mention. First of all, we will be conducting our 3-year review of the merit program, which is part of the statute that established this, and we'll be working with TSDAC to look at all aspects of the both the transit operating formula as well as the transit capital funding. In the JLARC study, they did actually recommend that because ridership was such a big focus of the transit operating formula, that perhaps DRPT should look at other factors such as equity that can be incorporated into that formula as well. So that's something I believe we have our first TISDAC meeting scheduled in March. I'm sure you'll hear a lot more about that over the next couple of months. We're also finalizing our transit equity and modernization study in 2022. We had a draft of that was presented to the General Assembly in December as well. And some recommendations from that may also be incorporated into the merit program. So we look forward to working with everyone on that. I do just want to touch on quickly kind of pivot from state issues to federal issues to talk a little bit about the IIJA funding and the impacts that that's going to have on the transit program as well. So we do expect that there's going to be an increase of about 30% overall for our transit agencies coming from the federal bill. As many of you know, though, that money is primarily for capital, not operating support. In addition to that, a lot of the funds that were allocated by Congress through the IIJA are also discretionary funds, many of which are for bus facilities and also for our capital investment grant program at the federal level too. So we are really going to encourage all of the transit agencies out there to apply as much as possible for these discretionary funds for the bus facilities. Also the Low-No program, which is out there to support acquisition of low emission and no emission or zero emission vehicles as well. All of our DRPT program managers will be reaching out to you to work with you. It's a great news at the federal level that they've providing this additional funding for these discretionary programs, but that money doesn't come into Virginia unless you all apply for it. And so again, the more that you all are able to seek federal funds, it also does supplement the state funding that we have available in the state program, so that there is more to go around for everybody. So we will receive in Virginia an additional 1.6 billion funding, an additional formula funding over the next 6 years. As I mentioned before, that's about a 30% increase. The additional funding that we're getting, it will be about, let's see, about the 5-year total. Yes, as I mentioned, 1.6 billion. As far, much of that is going up to Northern Virginia and WMATA, but there is funding as well by formula going to Hampton Roads, about 60 million, about 24 million for the Richmond area, about 5 million for Roanoke, and then an additional 24 million for small urban systems and 33 million for rural systems as well. We'll make sure that these numbers are put out there so you don't have to jot all of this down. But this is also information that I will be presenting later today to the House Appropriations Committee as well. So on the rail side, there is an additional $12.5 billion a year for passenger rail programs as well. But all of that funding is discretionary. The biggest pot of funds is for the federal state partnership program, which can be used to expand passenger rail across the state. There is also funds in what's called the CRISI program too, of about $1 billion per year. However, for the federal state partnership program, that's going to be shared with the Northeast Corridor. So up to 2/3 of that funding can go to the Northeast Corridor. And again, these are all discretionary programs that the state will have to apply for. And so what that means is that FRA over the next 6 months or so will be putting out notices of funding opportunity for some of these programs. We expect that those notices for some of the new programs will be coming out later in 2022. There's no firm timeline that's been set, but that's just based on what we've been hearing out of USDOT staff. So again, those will all be application-based programs that we'll have to compete for. So that's it for me and my update. I'll make sure that Lisa has access to all of this information as well, so that you guys can access it too. But we really appreciate all the support that you all have been providing on our legislative program, and be happy to answer questions later. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Thank you, Director. We have a few questions already, and I think we've got some time because I don't see Senator McClellan on. So let's start with some of the questions. One from Zach Trogdon of WADA. What is the anticipated application timeline for bus and bus facility grants?
I'll be honest, I don't know offhand when that's going to come up. We'd be happy to reach out to FTA and find out. Jen DeBrule, who's on the phone, may have a little bit more of a better sense of that. So if she is on the phone and you can put that in the chat, that would be great. But I'm not aware of the firm timeline for that yet.
All right, thank you. Tanisha Griffin asked, is there a link to the two studies presented to the General Assembly, the JLARC and the DRPT draft report?
Yes, I know that those are all available online. I don't know what the link is offhand, but we can also make sure that you guys get copies of that too. The JLARC report should be on JLARC's website. We did also give a CTB a presentation on that report last month, and so there should be also a pretty good presentation that Nick Donahue gave on that would be available on our CTB website for the meeting from December too.
Okay, let me check this. Here's a question, just questions about accessing the recording of this presentation, and Danny has already put in there. I don't know if everybody saw it, but we will be posting it to our YouTube channel later today or tomorrow under our webinar. So,
and I see that Jen DeBrule has provided the links to the JLARC report and comment on the bus facility. So thanks, Jen.
Okay, thank you. All right, I don't see any other questions at this point. So thank you very much. Do we have Senator McClellan on with us? And before Jennifer Mitchell leaves, I just want to thank her for her outstanding leadership in transit and moving the needle so considerably over the past 8 years. So Jennifer, you have just been a leader in that field, and we have appreciated very much everything that you have done. So we don't know where we are going forward, but we just want to put a marker down that we appreciate very much what you have done for us, and we hope that we'll have an opportunity to continue working with you.
Thanks, and I also want to thank the leadership that we had through Shannon Valentine as our secretary over the last 4 years, and also Nick Donahue, our deputy secretary, who really can't overstate the contributions that the two of them made in helping to boost our transit funding and really prioritize improvements to the program over the last 4 years. So while they're not on this call, if you do get a chance to send them a note, or if you see them, thank them as well, because they have both been real champions for transit and rail over the last 4 years.
It's really remarkable when you stop for a moment to take stock of how we have grown over the past few years and what we've been able to accomplish. It's in transportation that is something that was very long in coming, and that's why we're so devoted to hanging on to the progress that we've made. Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, sure.
All right. At this point, we may start with maybe with Jim Regimbal. So Jim, why don't we start with you? A couple of initial slides before we hear from the senator. Okay.
Guess you're going to put. Good morning, everyone. I think Danny Flower is going to put up my portion of the presentation.
Jim, can you see it?
Thanks. I'm not sure. You're going to have to go to the first slide. They don't want to see my face. They see it right there. This dovetails quite a bit with what Director Mitchell was talking about in terms of revenues and allocations. And so what I'm trying to give you guys a sense of what's happened to state Commonwealth Transportation Fund revenues. As you recall, last time I sat down with you, I was predicting that the 1.8 billion reduction in the state 6-year plan was going to be dramatically revised upwards. And that's exactly what happened. Hang on a second. I've got to stop something.
Okay. Okay, something has come up for Jim. So anyway, he's going to get back with us to talk about. Okay, all right,
I'm
Jim.
sorry, I had to
Okay,
stay at
good.
my home. I had people coming to my house today and
Okay.
they're making a racket. So I had to quiet them down. But so anyhow, the revenues did increase dramatically, and the 1.8 billion 6-year plan reduction that was adopted last year was significantly upgraded. And I give you some of the overall numbers right here. You know, the state revenues, I was predicting 2.4 billion increase. It was actually 2.6 billion that they increased the 6-year plan revenues because of what happened basically in fiscal 21 and what's occurring right now. Revenues are continuing to rise dramatically from what people thought was going to happen due to the pandemic. And then, of course, as Director Mitchell described, there's a significant injection of federal money that also is flowing through Virginia and its transportation program. So that's sort of in a nutshell what's happened. If you go to the next slide, please, I can start giving you some of the details of that. So this slide shows you that revenue forecast change and actuals that occurred in fiscal 21. You can see it was quite a bit more than fiscal 20. People thought that fiscal 21 was going to really be flat or negative, and it turned out to be a significant amount more than what was in 21 or what was in 20 and what they thought was going to be 21. And then you could see last year's adopted budget for fiscal 22 of just a little over $4 billion, and it actually is now forecasted to be 500 million more than that. And then at the last two columns show you the likelihood of making that forecast is pretty good, given that the year-to-date change is 15% through the first 6 months of the fiscal year versus the year-end forecast for fiscal 22 being a 10% increase. And it's actually growing at 15% right now. So there's a good likelihood we're going to make the 22 forecast. Next slide, please. So when you up the base on 22, that has flowed through the remaining 5 years of the 6-year plan, essentially, in their forecast. And so here's what the Commonwealth Transportation Fund by source is expected now to increase above what the previous 6-year plan was, 2.6 billion. As I stated in that opening slide. You can see the sources of revenue. A lot of it is sales and use tax and motor vehicle sales. I mean, those have been going gangbusters. We will see if people's forecasts are correct over the next 5 years. There's lots of moving parts. All this federal injection of funding over the last year through stimulus plans. You know, we got inflation going now. We got all sorts of things going to our economy. And so trying to forecast anything for 5 years is fraught with peril, but this is the current 6-year plan estimates in terms of increases. Next slide, please. And so as the director mentioned, Dr. Mitchell, lots of federal money. And this was what Laura Farmer presented to the Commonwealth Transportation Board a month or so ago, less than a month ago. Well, I guess about a month ago, yeah, that we're going to get additional federal funding over 6 years of 2.2 billion. I'd like to get more comment later at some point, talk to Director Mitchell. I didn't quite understand some of her numbers that she said was flowing through transit. And so I think we need to take a look at some of the numbers she mentioned and get some detail and go through that, because this is coming right out of the VDOT presentation to the Commonwealth Transportation Board. I didn't quite understand some of her numbers, but the bottom line is a lot of federal money, a lot of state money is coming through to Virginia because of what's happened in the last 6 months. Next slide, please. This is the change in allocations from the previous 6-year plan to the new 6-year plan. And this again is where I was not quite understanding Director Mitchell's comments on additional funding. This is what was in that presentation a month ago. And you can see, according to that, I bolded the amounts going to transit through the CTB allocations, and they are significant. My my understanding is this is both additional state funding and federal funding. It also includes some local match money, some debt, some additional debt. So there's other funds besides just direct revenues that are impacting allocations. Of course, the main things are the increase in revenues, the increase in federal funding, but you know, operating programs in total across the state, various programs up $5.5 billion, and then some additional pass-through monies above and beyond what was previously thought last year. So you can see, according to the presentation a month ago, over $6 billion in additional funding going to transportation, and you know, 800 million or so going to public transit. And that's where I'd like to delve into it deeper, the public transit part and how much more they're expecting in the next 6 years. If you go to the next slide, this does dovetail exactly with Director Mitchell's comments concerning this current fiscal year and how much additional money is going to public transit. You can see how it's flowing through the operating capital, WMATA, and the Transit Ridership Incentive Program, 185 million. That's the same number she mentioned. So this is due to that increase in monies available from the reforecast of revenues. So next slide. Next slide, Danny, please. Thanks. So how would that be impacted? How would these increased allocations be impacted in if some of the proposals to reduce taxes come about in this General Assembly session? As I understand it, the grocery tax 0.5%, when fully implemented, would cost about $130 million per year. The presentation in December by Secretary Joe Flores indicated a full percent from the general fund would be 262. Half of that is about 130 million. So that's my understanding of how much would be lost from the grocery tax. It is a 0.5% on food for home consumption. Food for home consumption is about 17% of the sales tax base. So I get the same number doing it that way. There's a one-time loss of monies based on an accounting change from the accelerated sales tax elimination. These were both should have been in the CTB budget already because Governor Northam proposed these in his budget. So those are already taken out. The grocery tax elimination started halfway through fiscal 23 because he intended to start that cut in January of 23, which is halfway through the first year. So the first full year would be fiscal 24, that 130 million. And then the new proposals that the Youngkin administration has talked about is a one-year rollback in the gas tax. That would cost $250 million because it's about $50 million a penny right now in motor fuel taxes and diesel, which he's also cutting. And then a one-year regional gas rollback which is 7.6 cents per gallon. In HB 297, that would be 380 million. And since they're only talking about 1 year, that would be just a one-time loss of revenue. And so you could reduce, and that's of course, so these are not all transit, obviously. These are the entire Commonwealth Transportation Fund impacts. And transit is generally about 11% of that total is the impact on them. So you can get a sense of, you know, if you're losing, of course, in the regionals, not 11%, the Commonwealth Transportation Fund regionals are totally different. So that would be a different impact. I'm not sure how that flows through transit, the regional taxes. Maybe there could be a comment on that. But the one-year gas tax rollback, about 11%, maybe about 30 million would be transit share of that loss of revenue. So, so that gives you an idea what would happen to those budgets I presented earlier. Next slide, please. And so I've got some appendices just to refresh your memory on how the current allocation formulas work and how the law was changed in 2020. You know, how we raised the gas taxes from 16.2 in 2 phases to 26.2. And that last phase in is what he wants to roll back for a year and some other various items. And then you can go to the next slide. And you can look at this at your leisure. And this is how the the Commonwealth Transportation Fund is cut up when monies come into it. Transportation Trust Fund gets a little less than half, and then that, of course, is allocated to the various programs through these shares right here. So 23% of 49 is basically how I get 11% for the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund. So that completes my presentation. I can try to answer questions if you'd like.
Okay. And just reiterating, Jim, on that last slide, Danny, can you put that last slide back, please?
Yeah.
Okay. Of that, I was looking to see if you had, yes, you had the transit fund is 11.3 of the CTF. So just to show that of the, you have a subset, that's a subset of the 23%. Okay,
Yeah.
a lot of numbers. You want to summarize, Jim? I think the good news is that we have additional revenue than the dire predictions of deep in the midst of the pandemic. The versus maybe some of the cautions about the potential rollbacks on those revenue sources.
Right. So there's significant new revenues. The reforecast of revenues brought in $2.6 billion in state revenues, and of course, federal revenues, some of which are formula, many of which are you've got to apply for. There's significant revenues there potentially, and the possible rollbacks of revenue would cut into that, but certainly wouldn't eliminate even the majority of those new revenues, so long as those forecasts come true.
Right.
And a lot of that has to do with the increased base due to higher 21 and now expected 22 revenues continuing to flow through at normal rates of growth, not the high rates of growth, but normal rates of growth that you might expect.
Okay, thank you, Jim. A lot of information. So let's see, I think we had a couple of questions. No open questions. Anything else anybody wants to know about the finances of transit and rail? Okay. Thank you, Jim. We appreciate it, and we'll continue to work with you. Appreciate your time this morning. And I see we have Senator McClellan joining us. So please welcome aboard, Senator. I know you're jumping between meetings, so we're glad you can squeeze us in.
I am. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you everybody for having me this morning. I understand that I might have missed a stirring introduction from your chair, so I apologize for that. But I just wanted to jump on and talk a little bit about a bill and a budget amendment that I am putting in. The first is a bill, and I don't have the bill number in front of me. I'll grab it in a second, but it will create the Transit Zero Emissions Transition Fund, which will put in place a mechanism to help to plan and implement zero emission technology across Virginia's public transit systems. This program and fund will assist local, regional, and state entities in transitioning their public transit bus fleets in infrastructure to zero emission fleets and infrastructure. It is very similar to a fund that was created by legislation from Delegate Mark Keene related to school buses, but that fund and program is limited to school buses. And so we felt that a separate fund would be appropriate for public transit. I also put in a budget amendment related to the bill itself, and then a separate budget amendment that would use $20 million in federal ARPA funds to provide pay incentives, such as signing and periodic retention bonuses throughout 2026 to public transit workers. There are about 40 public transit agencies across the Commonwealth with over 28,000 jobs annually. And we know how, I'm preaching to the choir, how important transit is, not only to low income communities, but I think just creating more efficient public transit is good for the environment, it's good for emissions, it's good for business. And we want to make sure that as we are addressing climate change in Virginia, we are including public transit in that conversation. But we also want to recognize that the transit system, like every system, has been hit hard with COVID and is going to need a little bit of help first to be sustained through this period, but also to address worker shortages that we are seeing both now and in the future. So those are the pieces of legislation that I wanted to hop on and talk about, and I'm happy to take any questions that you all have.
Thank you so much, Senator. I think this would be a good opportunity for anybody with a transit agency or anybody who is a transit rider who has been impacted by the curtailment of service to let the senator know, so that those are items that can be articulated in her testimony to the committees, that why the transit pay incentive is needed, that in some cases we've had transit agencies offer bonuses, signing bonuses. Some of it is not directly financial. Some of it is transit drivers have COVID and can't show up for work, but a lot of it is trying to get people on board as employees, and what your experiences are with that. This is a frontline position, that it's a difficult job. You're working with the public. You have these COVID requirements that transit agencies are trying to work around. So if you've had direct experience with as an agency of having to cut routes, please send us some information that highlights your experiences. If you are a rider in any of the areas that have had to cut routes and you are having difficulty getting to work or getting to the doctor or getting to having food access, please let us know that as well. Always firsthand experiences are important in telling our story about why legislation is needed. So thank you, Senator. And if we hear additional stories, we will certainly pass them along to you. I think that's very important. And as well as the zero emission, a lot of times, like with the VW funds, there were funds made available for electric buses and whatnot, but agencies had to find the resources within their own agency budgets to provide that, to go hire consultants, to bring in planners to help them assist of where they're going in the next 10 years with their transition. Often they don't have the staff that's in a position to do that. So that's going to be very helpful if we're successful with this. Also helping mechanics learn how to work on some of these buses and whatnot. I think that we are entering a new day, and all of these support services are essential to making it successful. So let's see if I have any questions. Do not at this point. So anyway, with that, we will continue to keep you posted, Senator. And again, we thank you for your support of transit and for transit riders and workers, and I appreciate your support very much. Thanks for working us in this morning.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. And it is Senate Bill 488. It has been referred to the Finance and Appropriations Committee, which meets Tuesdays and Wednesdays. It has not been docketed yet, but I will let Lisa know as soon as it is. And if anyone wishes to testify on behalf of the bill, we'll make sure you get all the information to do that virtually, or if you want to come down and do it in person, happy to have you do that as well. But thank you all, and thank you for everything you do.
Okay, appreciate it. So we've got some great advocates out there. We have some in the social justice community and the environmental community and the transit ridership community. And we're calling on you to step forward and tell your story about why transit is essential to your quality of life. So with that, we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the importance of advocacy and how grassroots support can be very influential in the legislative process. So now I'm pleased to turn it over to Conor Kish, if Conor is on. Welcome, Conor. Conor has the unique position of having worked for a legislator with Delegate Betsy Carr, and now he is the legislative director for the Sierra Club Virginia chapter. So he kind of sees how effective legislation occurs on both sides of the desk, from the legislator's perspective and from the nonprofit advocacy perspective. So take it away, Conor.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Good morning, everybody. I appreciate being invited to join you this morning. I am Conor Kish, and I am the Legislative Political Director for the Sierra Club here in Virginia. And as Lisa mentioned, I'm a former General Assembly staff member to Delegate Betsy Carr, who I served for a number of years as Chief of Staff, and have a unique understanding of how advocates and community members can bring their ideas and priorities forward to legislators and have them be heard and responded to. One of the things that I want to touch on today is how COVID has really changed that process for the better in some ways, and want to highlight some opportunities where you can be involved as an advocate that maybe you wouldn't have been able to be involved in before COVID. So one of the things, and it was the perfect opportunity to have the great Senator Jennifer McClellan come right before me, because it showed exactly what I want to talk about, which is that over the past roughly 2 years since we've been dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, legislators and their offices have gotten really creative in how they go about meeting with constituents, how they go about meeting with the civic organization in their district or the neighborhood association in their district, or even advocates like you and me. And that is through Zoom. And I worked in the legislature for so many years before I took the job that I currently have, and I never once had a Zoom meeting with a legislator. Rarely did I even have a phone call with a legislator or with an advocate. But we now have these opportunities where legislators and their offices have morphed into this hybrid sort of operation, where whether you're near or far, advocates are having the opportunity to come forward and have their voices heard in a way that has not occurred before. And the legislators, as you just saw Senator McClellan hop on and hop off, are getting much better at understanding how quickly they can do it with ease and still make sure that they're hearing from their constituents and from advocates. And it's a real opportunity because no matter where you are in Virginia, whether you're 10 minutes away in Richmond, whether you're 2 hours away in Virginia Beach, whether you're 5 hours away in Southwest Virginia, it's a drive to get to Richmond and advocate for your priorities, whether it be a bill hearing or otherwise, just to meet with some legislators. Well, the COVID crisis has really showed us that we don't need to operate that way, and we can bring advocates from all over the Commonwealth right into a meeting with their senator delegate to have their interests brought forward and be heard. And the Zoom meetings with legislators has an alternative benefit that I think is understated in some ways, and that is that for advocates who aren't experienced or who don't lobby for a profession like I do, meeting with your legislator can be kind of scary. What do you say? What do you wear? Where do you go? Where do you sit? And are they intimidating? Are they going to ask you a lot of questions? Well, Zoom is an even playing field for everybody, and they all have the opportunity to get on that little square box and share their thoughts, and that senator or delegate is right there on that square box with you. And it's really an opportunity to have a really positive introduction to advocating, because you're not faced with the logistical challenges of coming to Richmond or the nervousness that might come along with meeting with a legislator when you just feel like you're kind of an active, average citizen. Are they going to listen to me? So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is how you can really take advantage of this virtual civic engagement, this time period that we're operating in, which, as we're all here on Zoom today, continues to be a challenge. But let's take advantage of the opportunities that it brings to bring our priorities forward and have people's voices be heard. So one of the things that I recommend is, and I recommend it to Sierra Club members, I'll recommend it to you, is reach out for a Zoom meeting with your legislator. The General Assembly operates on a pretty strict schedule, and legislators are typically available to take meetings in the mornings, anywhere from 7:30 a.m. to around 11 a.m. Typically, legislators are scheduling meetings with constituents and advocates. Well, 7 a.m. and you're 5 hours away, that's a long drive to Richmond. So take advantage of scheduling a Zoom meeting. The Zoom meetings, as I just mentioned, can be more casual, can be more conversational, and you also have the opportunity to share documents in the chat directly with the legislator and their offices who can grab those out of the chat as you're speaking. But one of the things that I think is really critical to understand when you're doing this is thinking back to when we just heard from Senator McClellan, who popped in, popped right out. Legislators do have limited time, right? So it's not like you're going to be able to gather an hour, 2 hours with legislators as you might like to talk about the issues. You're going to have maybe 10, maybe 15 minutes via Zoom. And so you really want to have your talking points down. You want to have your priorities down. You want to make sure that you are following some basic steps, which are listed on this very handy sheet that is being put up on the screen while I'm talking. But you want to know what you're going to talk about. You want to introduce yourself. You want to make sure you mention why they're going to be interested. And then you want to mention why it's important to you personally and why you're taking the time to come and talk to the legislator. Because as you can imagine, legislators are completely bombarded and the staff is completely bombarded as well during the General Assembly session. And they're looking for hints of things that they need to pay attention to. They're in a lot of meetings where they have to nod along, right? They're nodding along, they're saying yes, they're saying they're agreeable, but you want to be able to hook them with something personal, something that they'll remember as they continue to go through their day-long meetings, some on Zoom and some not on Zoom. But you want to make sure you've got that meeting organized. You hook them in, you make a personal touch, and you have your ask ready. You want to make your ask as simple as possible, just like as you would in an in-person meeting. But remember, the Zoom time is going to pop out and you won't be physically removed from an office like you would in person, but you will be kicked out of that legislator's Zoom room. So make sure you've got your timeline down. And there's also a really important aspect of virtual things that I found over the past 2 years, which is it has probably tripled the importance of follow-up after the meeting. When you are in, like I am most days, maybe 6, 7, 12 Zoom meetings, you're going to forget what happened in some of those meetings and what was the takeaway, what was the ask that someone made of you, what was that next step you were supposed to do, did someone say they were going to do something, I can't remember. It's really important that you have someone in that meeting writing down actions that are needed. For instance, the senator says, I need you to get me some more information about X. Well, somebody better write that down to make sure that information gets back to the senator in a follow-up email or call to their office to make sure that you're bringing the meeting back up. Make sure that they're remembering that it happened and that there were action items from it that you want taken. But I think the most important thing that you can do right now is not be afraid to reach out to your legislator to schedule a meeting and not be afraid to use Zoom to do it. Because I think this is a real opportunity for all of us to take advantage of the otherwise difficult and really challenging circumstances that we're faced with to learn about how we can be better advocates and better citizens along the way. So make sure that you're taking advantage of this opportunity. And please don't be scared to contact your legislators' offices or their staff, because I promise they're not that scary. Some of them are, but some of them are not. I'm just kidding. But I promise it's not that scary of an experience, and you will be able to feel like you've accomplished something at the end of it. I believe that Lisa and others may share out the item that's on the screen right now while I'm talking for your use, but it was provided by the Virginia Conservation Network, which is an organization of about 150 environmental and conservation groups across Virginia that get together to form a network that we use for advocacy purposes and to coordinate our priorities. And they've developed this really handy one-pager to help folks get used to making those asks of senators and getting ready to have and delegates and getting through those meetings with a proper agenda and proper next steps so that your time is really made worth it. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. And I'll pass it back to, I think, Lisa.
Hey, thank you, Connor. I think that's a very good advice on following up and making sure that that the legislator remembers you and what your story was and what your ask was. A question from Suzanne Hall, how can a social justice advocate advocate for transit after thanking her representatives who support these issues? And I guess maybe this is a good juncture to talk about timeliness, making sure that you're talking to your legislators about issues that are in front of them, not the ones that have already passed, not the ones that are so far in the future they are not even on the radar screen, but talking about when something is relevant and how to find out how something is relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thankfully for you all have Lisa and VTA who are probably keeping you up to date on what bills are important and when they're important and when you need to act. But I think that in addition to thanking them or making an ask of them while the situation is very, very relevant, I also want to mention the importance of using the time outside of the legislative session to connect and have these meetings with your legislators. It could be April, May when you schedule a meeting and say, I just really want to thank you. During session, you voted for X, which is a really big priority of mine, and would love to talk more to you about that and make sure you understand what you did and why it's really helpful. Also want to make sure you know what the next step on that issue is. There's a lot for these folks to remember in this either 45 or 60-day time period. The in-session meetings kind of are a blip on the radar. But outside of session, you can really use it to build a relationship with the legislature. And you can, to the question, thank, that would be an appropriate time to thank, right? Because they're looking for some positive feedback, right, about the actions they took during session. Make sure they don't feel like they've done something wrong. You definitely want to make sure that they know that they're appreciated. So really remember this as a whole year approach. You want to thank after, you want to start prepping in the summer, you want to start advocating in the winter, you want to start meeting during session, and then redo that, right, throughout the whole year. And legislators, I promise you, they like it. They love to talk to constituents outside of the session, and many of them are used to doing it and are fairly easy to get a hold of outside of the session. But think of it as a whole year approach. It doesn't have to just be a one-off conversation with a legislator. It can be part of a relationship building effort. And legislators really, really appreciate that, particularly when they have constituents who will talk to them year round. They become a voice that the legislator can trust, a voice that the legislator is used to hearing, same with staff. And it can really help you make sure your priorities are elevated.
Okay. We just had a comment from a bike rider who was injured and recognizes that transit could be a lifeline to jobs. If you couldn't get to work, you could lose your job, lost wages, termination. So how important it is. So that's true all over the state, not just in the city core, but all over the state. People rely on transit to get to essential services. So continue to emphasize that with elected officials, because sometimes it's thought of as just an urban issue when really it affects everybody everywhere, and every legislator should hear that from their constituents. So any other comments, Connor? I don't see anything else in the chat or Q&A. We can share information about the bills that we talked about when we follow up, and put that on our YouTube with the webinar recording. Danny, anything else you want to say about that?
No, it will be up today or tomorrow, and we'll send out more information to everybody who registered.
And if you go to the Virginia General Assembly website, they will allow you to create your own little bill tracking chart. It's those of us that lobby have a paid service called Lobbyist in a Box, but you can set up your own small one free of charge. If you go to the Virginia General Assembly site, it can walk you through that. So you can track your bill and see when it's going to committee, when it's going to the floor, etc. So anyway, with that, I see some other appreciation. Thank you everybody who commented, and thank you to all of our presentation sponsors here. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to our president, Mayor Wilson.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And I want to thank all of our presenters today. This is a very captivating conversation with a lot of different perspectives on the important transit investments that we have before us. I want to especially thank our sponsors who made this happen. And just remind you that we have our conference and bus expo coming up in Roanoke, Virginia on June 1st and June 2nd. There will be no inclement weather that will threaten that event. We'll have hopefully all of this pandemic behind us, and we'll be able to gather together in June in Roanoke. And so we look forward to seeing you. Thank you so much for being here today, and enjoy the rest of the General Assembly session. I hope all the good bills are passed and all the bad bills fail, and we go from there. So thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everybody.